My husband said, if you can't trust me spending every weekend with my ex-wife, maybe we shouldn't be together. I looked him straight in the eye and said, you're right. The next morning, I signed the London transfer papers I'd been turning down for him. When he texted, what are you doing this weekend? I sent a selfie from Heathrow Airport. You know that moment when your entire world just shatters? Mine started with a text message at 5:47 a.m., glowing like a neon sign in our darkened bedroom. It wasn't just any text, it was from Daisy, Colton's ex-wife, and it read, can't wait to see you today. It's been too long. D. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely set his phone back exactly where I found it. Daisy. The woman he'd been meeting every single Sunday for 3 months, claiming it was just innocent coffee between old friends. And now, she was apparently counting down the hours until she saw my husband again. I slipped back under our Egyptian cotton sheets, my heart thudding, pretending to be asleep while my mind raced. Who sends messages that early unless they've been thinking about someone all night? I forced my breathing to stay steady as Colton stirred beside me. His hand, like clockwork, automatically reached for his phone. The soft glow illuminated his face as he read it, and I watched through barely opened eyes as a slow smile spread across his features. The kind of smile I hadn't seen directed at anything involving me in months. He typed back quickly, his fingers moving with a practiced familiarity that stabbed me in the gut. The response was brief, but his expression suggested it was loaded with meaning I wasn't meant to understand. Morning, beautiful. His voice carried that forced cheerfulness people use when they're hiding something significant. He leaned over to kiss my forehead, and I caught a whiff of the expensive cologne he'd already applied. At 6 o'clock in the morning? For Sunday coffee with a friend? I murmured something non-committal and rolled over, giving him space to continue whatever performance he was staging. Through the mirror on our dresser, I watched him select his outfit with the kind of meticulous care usually reserved for job interviews or first dates. The cashmere sweater I bought him for Christmas. The designer jeans that cost more than most people's rent. Everything coordinated to look effortlessly expensive. This was our Sunday routine now. For 3 months, ever since Daisy Morrison announced her return to London via a carefully casual text that Colton had shared with me like it was completely innocent. My ex-wife is back in town. Might grab coffee to catch up. Such simple words for something that would systematically dismantle our marriage, one weekend at a time. I remember that first Sunday clearly. Colton had dressed normally then. Weekend casual, 5 minutes to get ready, barely a glance in the mirror. He'd returned 2 hours later, brimming with stories about Daisy's photography career in New York, her struggles readjusting to London, how she needed guidance, navigating the competitive art world. I'd listened, organizing our bookshelf, noting the animation in his voice when he described her projects, the way his eyes lit up discussing her creative vision. Maybe we should have her over for dinner, I'd suggested, testing the waters. I'd love to meet her properly. The suggestion landed like a stone in still water. Colton's enthusiasm vanished, replaced by that careful expression he wore during difficult client negotiations. She's very private right now, going through a difficult transition. Maybe once she's more settled. That should have been my first warning. In 4 years of marriage, Colton had never been protective of anyone's privacy except his own. But I'd wanted to trust him. Trusted the man who'd promised me forever in a church filled with 200 witnesses. Trusted the partner who'd built this beautiful life with me, brick by expensive brick. Our Georgian townhouse, featured in 3 different design magazines. My thriving marketing consultancy. His corner office overlooking the Thames. We were the couple other people envied at dinner parties, the ones who seemed to have cracked the code on having it all. So, I'd ignored the warning bells. Ignored the way he started caring about his appearance on Sundays. Ignored the increasing frequency of their meetings, the lengthening duration, the late-night phone calls that sent him walking out to our garden for privacy. I'd even ignored my own instincts when those calls started happening during our dinner conversations. Colton apologizing while stepping outside to help Daisy with some urgent professional crisis that always seemed to occur during our limited time together. The shower started running, and I knew I had exactly 20 minutes before he emerged, fully prepared for another day and his alternate reality. 20 minutes to lie here and pretend I didn't know what I knew. Pretend I hadn't seen the credit card charges from expensive Shoreditch restaurants. Pretend I hadn't noticed how our weekend plans always got canceled for Daisy emergencies. Pretend I hadn't started sleeping in the guest room because listening to his late-night conversations with her made me feel sick. My phone buzzed on my nightstand. An email from my company's London office, marked urgent. The subject line made my stomach flip. European Division Director. Final consideration. Time sensitive. I deleted it without opening, just like I did with the previous two offers. £145,000 annually to head their European division. My own team. Unlimited creative control. A chance to build something entirely my own. But accepting would mean disrupting our perfect Richmond life. Abandoning the beautiful existence Colton and I had constructed together. Except our life wasn't perfect anymore, was it? It was a carefully maintained illusion, like one of those movie sets that looks real from the front but reveals itself to be nothing but scaffolding and paint when viewed from behind. The water stopped running. I heard him humming something while he toweled off. Actually humming while preparing for his weekly betrayal. The sound made my chest tight with a combination of fury and heartbreak that I was becoming too familiar with. I forced myself out of bed and down to our kitchen, needing the ritual of making coffee to ground me in something real. The morning light streamed through our custom Italian curtains, hitting the marble countertops we spent months selecting. Everything in this room spoke of partnership, of shared decisions and combined dreams. The espresso machine we bought in Tuscany. The dining table where we'd hosted dozens of dinner parties. The kitchen island where we'd planned vacations and discussed 5-year goals and imagined the children we'd eventually have. All of it felt like evidence of a crime now. Proof of what I was losing to a woman who wore vintage band t-shirts and made artistic poverty look effortlessly chic. Colton appeared in the doorway, freshly showered and perfectly groomed. He was wearing that cologne again. The expensive one he claimed was a gift from a client, but which I'd never seen him wear for any client meeting. His hair was styled with a kind of careful precision usually reserved for board presentations or photo shoots. "Coffee smells amazing," he said, kissing my cheek with lips that tasted like the mouthwash he used before important meetings. "You're up early for a Sunday." I wanted to ask him about the text. Wanted to demand explanations for the morning routine that had become increasingly elaborate. Wanted to know why his ex-wife was counting down hours until she saw him. Instead, I handed him his coffee in the mug I bought him last Christmas, the one that said "World's Best Husband" in elegant script. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. "Another crisis with Daisy?" I asked, keeping my voice carefully neutral. He nodded, already checking his phone again. "Gallery politics. You know how complicated the art world can be." I didn't actually. Neither did he, as far as I knew, until 3 months ago when he apparently became an expert in creative industry navigation. But I nodded anyway, playing my role in whatever script we were both pretending to follow. He left 20 minutes later with a kiss that felt like an apology and a promise to be back by dinner. I watched from our front window as he walked to his car, noting the spring in his step that used to be reserved for our date nights. The car disappeared around the corner, carrying my husband toward whatever fantasy he'd constructed with the woman who used to share his name. I was still standing at the window when my phone buzzed again. Another email from London. This time, I didn't delete it immediately. Instead, I stared at the subject line and wondered what would happen if I finally said yes to the life that had been waiting for me while I'd been busy trying to save the one that was already over. The London email sat in my phone, unopened but impossible to ignore. I poured myself another cup of coffee and settled at our kitchen island, letting the silence of our empty house wrap around me like a blanket I didn't want but needed. 2 weeks passed before I noticed the changes in Colton's Sunday preparations. It started with a cologne. Not his usual weekday scent, but something deeper, more expensive. The kind he wore on our first anniversary dinner at that restaurant in Mayfair, where we couldn't afford the wine, but ordered it anyway. I was organizing our walk-in closet when I spotted the Hermes shirt missing from its usual place. The navy one with a subtle pattern that I'd spent 3 weeks' worth of grocery money on for our anniversary. It was Tuesday, and Colton was at the office wearing his standard corporate uniform, which meant that shirt went somewhere else entirely. Sunday morning confirmed my suspicion. He emerged from our bathroom wearing it, paired with dark jeans that probably cost more than our monthly electric bill. The casual elegance of someone dressing to impress while pretending not to care. "Nice shirt," I commented, folding his weekend clothes into neat piles. "Special occasion?" His fingers paused on his watch clasp. "Just coffee with Daisy." You know how image-conscious the art world can be, right? Because, obviously, his ex-wife's professional network required him to dress like he was attending a gallery opening rather than grabbing a quick coffee between old friends. I watched him spend 25 minutes on his hair, using products I'd never seen him touch before. When he caught me observing his reflection in the bathroom mirror, he offered a sheepish grin. "Important networking," he explained, as if styling his hair like a magazine model was standard procedure for maintaining professional relationships. "Must be some important networking," I said, attempting lightness while something cold settled in my stomach. All this preparation for Daisy. The transformation was immediate. His face hardened, shoulders squaring like he was preparing for battle. "Don't be ridiculous, Paige. Adults can be friends with their exes without it meaning anything." The word ridiculous hit me wrong. For years of marriage, and he'd never called my concerns ridiculous before. Misguided, maybe. Overthinking, certainly. But never ridiculous, like I was some jealous teenager imagining problems that didn't exist. "I didn't say it meant anything," I replied carefully. "Just noticed you're dressing up more than usual." He softened slightly, but the damage was done. That word hung between us like smoke from a fire we were both pretending not to smell. Monday brought lunch with Sarah at our usual spot, a cafe in Richmond that served overpriced salads to women who lunched professionally. I needed someone to tell me I was overthinking, that marriages go through phases, that everything would return to normal once Daisy settled into her London life and stopped requiring my husband's constant guidance. Instead, Sarah delivered a lecture about trust and emotional maturity while picking at her quinoa bowl. "You're being insecure," she said, stirring her oat milk latte with the kind of confidence people have when they've never experienced real betrayal. "It's actually beautiful that they can maintain a friendship. Shows real emotional evolution." Beautiful. That's the word she chose while I described watching my husband transform into someone I didn't recognize every Sunday morning. But don't you think it's a bit much? Every weekend, 4 hours at a time. Sarah's smile carried that particular condescension reserved for women who think they've figured out the secret to successful relationships. "Paige, sweetie, if you can't trust your husband to have coffee with an old friend, maybe the problem isn't him." I left feeling worse than when I arrived, Sarah's words echoing in my head while I drove home through Richmond's tree-lined streets. Maybe I was being insecure. Maybe this was what mature relationships looked like. Trusting your partner completely, even when every instinct screamed that something was wrong. Tuesday's business meeting with James provided a different perspective entirely. We'd been partners for 5 years, building our marketing consultancy from nothing into something respectable. James knew me well enough to read the tension in my shoulders, the distraction in my responses to client updates. "Everything all right at home?" he asked while we reviewed quarterly projections. I found myself describing Colton's Sunday routine, the increasing frequency of meetings, the elaborate preparation for casual coffee dates. James listened without interrupting, his expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, he didn't offer reassurance or advice. He just raised his eyebrows in that way I'd learned to interpret over years of working together. The expression he wears when clients describe marketing strategies that make no logical sense. "Interesting," is all he said, but his silence spoke volumes. Later, as we were packing up our laptops, he mentioned, almost casually, "Saw Colton last Sunday, actually. At that new place in Shoreditch, the one with the exposed brick and the 20-pound steaks." My hands stilled on my keyboard. "Shoreditch?" He said they were getting coffee in Richmond. James's expression grew carefully neutral. Maybe they changed plans. He was with a woman, brunette, artistic-looking. They seemed. He paused, choosing his words carefully. Looked like they were on a date. The words hit me like cold water. James quickly changed the subject to client retention rates, but the damage was done. My husband lied about where he was meeting his ex-wife, and they were somewhere expensive enough that James remembered it specifically. October arrived with longer Sunday meetings and a new development that made my chest tight with recognition. The phone calls started happening at night, usually around 10 p.m., when we were settling in to watch television or read. Colton's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and his entire demeanor shifted. "Sorry, it's Daisy. Client emergency." He'd step out to our garden, leaving me alone with the muted television and the sound of his animated conversation drifting through the French doors. I couldn't make out words, but his tone was different during these calls. Warmer. More engaged than I'd heard him sound in months. The conversations stretched longer each week. 20 minutes became 30, then 45. I found myself timing them, lying in bed, listening to the rise and fall of his voice while he paced our garden path. He laughed during these calls. Genuine, delighted laughter that made me realize I couldn't remember the last time he laughed like that with me. When he returned to our bedroom, he was always apologetic but vague about the emergencies requiring such lengthy discussions: gallery politics, client negotiations, industry connections. Daisy apparently needed guidance navigating London's competitive art scene, and my husband had somehow become an expert in creative industry management, despite never showing interest in art beyond what looked impressive on our walls. What kind of client problems require midnight consultations? I asked one night after he spent an hour outside talking her through some undefined crisis. He slipped back under our covers, phone finally silent on his nightstand. You know how creative types are. Everything's urgent and emotional. She just needs someone who understands the business side, right? Because the woman who built a successful photography career in New York, one of the world's most competitive markets, suddenly needed my husband's guidance handling basic professional situations. The phone never seemed to sleep anymore. It buzzed during our dinner conversations, interrupting movies we were watching together, lighting up the dark bedroom at all hours with messages from D. When I asked about the constant contact, Colton explained that Daisy was struggling with the transition back to London, needs emotional support, requires advice on everything from apartment hunting to rebuilding her professional network. She's very fragile right now, he'd say, as if this explained why his ex-wife required more attention than his actual wife. Fragile. The word started appearing frequently in his descriptions of Daisy. Fragile emotional state, fragile professional situation, fragile adjustment to London life. This woman who packed up her entire existence and moved to another country to pursue her career was apparently too delicate to handle basic life challenges without my husband's constant intervention. I started sleeping in our guest room, telling myself it was because his late-night conversations kept me awake. But the truth was more complicated. Lying next to someone while they prioritized another woman's needs over your shared bedtime felt like a special kind of torture I wasn't ready to endure every night. From the guest room, I could still hear him talking to her through the walls. His voice carried differently at night, softer and more intimate than the fragments I heard during the day. Reassurances about her talent, encouragement about her prospects, promises that things would get better. I couldn't remember the last time he spoke to me with that kind of gentle certainty. The guest room became my sanctuary and my prison. 3 weeks into my self-imposed exile from our shared bed, I discovered the dark magic of social media stalking at 2 o'clock in the morning. Insomnia had become my unwelcome companion, arriving precisely when Colton's breathing settled into the deep rhythm of someone sleeping peacefully despite systematically destroying his marriage. Tonight, like so many others, I found myself reaching for my phone, thumb hovering over the Instagram app with the kind of hesitation people reserve for opening medical test results. Daisy Morrison's profile loaded with cruel efficiency. No privacy settings, no barriers between me and the curated glimpse into the life that was consuming my husband's attention. Her feed was exactly what I expected. Artfully arranged chaos that screamed authentic bohemian lifestyle. Vintage band t-shirts draped over unmade beds. Gallery openings captured in moody black and white. Coffee cups photographed from angles that suggested deep artistic contemplation. But it's the locations that made my blood freeze in my veins. Richmond Farmers Market. Tagged 14 days ago. The same Sunday Colton claimed they were meeting for coffee in some generic cafe. The photo showed autumn produce arranged like a still life. But I recognized the vendor stalls, the cobblestone layout, the Victorian lampposts that line the market square where Colton and I had shopped together every other weekend for 4 years. I scrolled further, my thumb moving with the mechanical persistence of someone picking at a wound. Our favorite antique shop on Hill Rise, photographed 6 days ago with the caption, "Hidden treasures in unexpected places." The image showed vintage jewelry displayed against weathered wood. The same display case where Colton and I found the Art Deco mirror hanging in our hallway. He wasn't just meeting my husband. He was touring my life, documenting places that belonged to us, locations that held our shared memories and inside jokes. Each photo felt like evidence of territorial conquest, a systematic claiming of spaces I thought were ours alone. The worst part is how beautiful her photography was. Each image composed with professional skill, transforming mundane locations into something that looked worthy of gallery walls. She had an eye for finding poetry in places I'd always considered simply functional. Seeing my life through her artistic lens made me feel ordinary by comparison. Like I'd been living in black and white while she saw everything in vivid color. Morning brought the monthly ritual of organizing our finances. A task I'd always handled because Colton found numbers tedious unless they were attached to his quarterly bonuses. I spread bank statements across our dining room table, cross-referencing receipts with automated charges, looking for the familiar patterns of our predictable life. Instead, I found evidence of someone else's existence threaded through our accounts like foreign DNA. Lou Bernadine in Shoreditch. 180 pounds for dinner on a Sunday when Colton told me they grabbed sandwiches at a local cafe. Saatchi Gallery admission for 2, purchased the same afternoon he claimed they spent walking through Richmond Park discussing her career prospects. Most damning of all, charges from the Ned's lobby. Bar in central London, dated last Sunday, when he swore they had a quick coffee before he came home early because Daisy was feeling overwhelmed. The numbers don't lie, even when everything else does. I photographed each suspicious charge with my phone, building a digital case file I wasn't sure I wanted to prosecute. When Colton appeared in our kitchen that evening, loosening his tie after another day of managing other people's money, I spread the statements in front of him like cards in a poker game. "Expensive coffee dates," I said, pointing to the Shoreditch restaurant charge. His reaction was immediate and smooth. Too smooth, like he'd been preparing for this conversation. That wasn't coffee. We met some gallery owners Daisy knows from New York. Networking dinner. You know how important connections are in creative industries. The explanation came so naturally, I almost believed him. Almost. Until I pointed to the gallery admission charges and watched him construct another elaborate fiction about attending exhibitions to better understand Daisy's artistic influences. 2 tickets? I asked. She needed moral support. These gallery events can be intimidating when you're trying to rebuild professional relationships. Each lie built on the previous one, creating an increasingly complex narrative that explained away every suspicious detail. His voice carried the confidence of someone who'd practiced these explanations, refined them until they sounded not just plausible, but reasonable. The hotel bar charge required the most creative storytelling. According to Colton, they met a potential client there who was only available for 30 minutes between flights. Daisy had been nervous about the meeting, needed his support navigating the conversation, and afterward, they'd shared a quick drink to debrief the interaction. His lies came so smoothly, I started questioning my own interpretation of the evidence. Maybe these charges did have innocent explanations. Maybe I was seeing conspiracies where simple friendship existed. Maybe Sarah was right about my insecurity poisoning my perspective. Saturday morning laundry became an archaeological expedition. Sorting through our clothes, I realized Colton's favorite leather jacket hadn't appeared in the hamper for 3 weeks. Neither had the navy wool scarf I brought him from Paris last year, the one he claimed made him look sophisticated enough for European business meetings. When I asked about the missing items, he didn't even look up from his newspaper. Dry cleaners. That jacket needs special care, and the scarf got stained at lunch last week. But I checked Somerset Cleaners on Monday afternoon, the place we'd used for 5 years. The woman behind the counter knows us by name, remembers our usual pickups. She shook her head when I described the jacket and scarf. Haven't seen those pieces, love. Nothing of your husband's has been in for over a month. I stood in the shop, surrounded by plastic-wrapped clothes that belonged to other people's lives, realizing that items were disappearing from our home the same way pieces of our marriage were vanishing. Small things at first, barely noticeable. Then larger absences that left obvious gaps. That evening, I started keeping mental inventories of Colton's wardrobe, not from paranoia, but from a growing need to document the systematic dismantling of our shared life. The expensive watch he wore to last year's company party. The silk tie his mother gave him for his birthday. Each missing piece felt like evidence in a case I was building against my own husband. Wednesday afternoon found me in our front garden, planting tulip bulbs for spring blooms I was no longer sure I'd be around to see. The physical work felt therapeutic. Digging into soil, placing bulbs with careful spacing, covering them with earth and hope that they'd emerge beautiful when the weather turned warm again. Lovely afternoon for gardening. Mrs. Patterson's voice carried over the hedge separating our properties. She's 70-something and has lived in Richmond long enough to know everyone's business without meaning to pry. We chatted about bulb varieties and optimal planting depths until she mentioned seeing Colton last Sunday. Your husband's got good taste in walking routes. Richmond Park is beautiful this time of year. My hands stilled on the soil. Walking routes. Oh yes. I was coming back from visiting my sister and saw him near the Albert Gate. Lovely day for a romantic stroll. The word romantic hit me like cold water. He was alone? Mrs. Patterson's expression shifted, her friendly demeanor clouding with the realization that she'd stumbled into dangerous territory. Well, no, dear. He was with a woman. Brunette, quite pretty in that artistic way. They were walking hand in hand, looking very much like a couple enjoying the afternoon together. She described Daisy with uncomfortable accuracy. The vintage clothing, the camera hanging around her neck, the way she leaned into Colton while they walked. Every detail matched the woman I'd been studying through Instagram photos. The woman my husband claims requires nothing more than friendly coffee and professional guidance. Mrs. Patterson realized she'd delivered devastating news and quickly changed the subject to her rose bushes and their preparation for winter dormancy. But the damage was done. My neighbor, someone with no agenda beyond pleasant conversation, had provided eyewitness testimony that my husband and his ex-wife were behaving like lovers, not old friends catching up over innocent coffee. I finished planting the tulip bulbs with hands that shook despite the mild afternoon temperature. Dirt accumulated under my fingernails, and I thought about how deep I'd been buried in lies without realizing the soil was covering my head. Each bulb I placed in the ground felt like hope I wasn't sure I still possessed. Faith in futures that might not include the man I married. The sun set over Richmond while I worked, painting our neighborhood in golden light that made everything look beautiful and peaceful. But beauty can be deceptive. I was learning the most picturesque lives can conceal the ugliest truths. And sometimes the evidence of betrayal is as simple as your neighbor mentioning they saw your husband holding hands with another woman in the park where you used to walk together. The tulip bulbs lay buried in our front garden like secrets I'd planted in rich soil, waiting for spring to reveal what I'd known all along. I cleaned the dirt from under my fingernails with mechanical precision. Each scrape of the nail brush echoing Mrs. Patterson's words about romantic strolls and hand-holding that had nothing to do with professional coffee meetings. The next few days passed in a strange, suspended state where I went through the motions of our life while building a case against it. Work meetings blended together. Client calls became background noise. I smiled at appropriate moments during conversations I wasn't really hearing. All while my phone burned with screenshots and evidence I couldn't stop collecting. Thursday evening changed everything. I was reviewing quarterly projections when Daisy's Instagram story notification popped up on my phone. The image loaded with devastating clarity. A gallery opening in Shoreditch. All exposed brick walls and industrial lighting. Daisy stood among well-dressed art enthusiasts, wearing a black dress I'd never seen, but accessorized with something that made my breath catch. My grandmother's vintage pearl earrings. The ones with the intricate silver settings that took 3 generations to reach me. The earrings Colton borrowed last month for what he called an important client event that required elegant accessories to make the right impression. I zoomed in until the screen pixelated, but there was no mistaking them. Those earrings had been in my family since 1952, passed from my grandmother to my mother to me with stories about wearing them on special occasions, about saving them for moments that mattered. Apparently, gallery openings with his ex-wife qualified as moments that matter. The timestamp showed Thursday at 8:30 p.m. Last Thursday, when Colton claimed he was working late on year-end budgets, when I ate dinner alone and went to bed early because he texted that the numbers were taking longer than expected. While I was falling asleep in our guest room, he was watching his ex-wife wear my grandmother's jewelry to art openings in neighborhoods he'd never taken me to explore. I screenshot everything with shaking fingers, adding it to the growing folder of evidence I'd labeled documentation because calling it what it really is felt too devastating to acknowledge. The photo joined bank statements, Instagram posts, and timeline discrepancies in a digital archive of betrayal that grew heavier each day. By Friday morning, the earrings were back in my jewelry box, nestled in their usual velvet compartment like they never left. But touching them felt different now, contaminated by the knowledge of where they'd been, whose skin they'd touched, what moments they'd witnessed that had nothing to do with our marriage. Friday afternoon delivered an unexpected lifeline disguised as a phone call. My boss's voice carried excitement that cut through the fog of domestic surveillance I'd been living in. "Paige, I need you to consider something extraordinary. We're not just talking about a transfer anymore. We want you to launch our entire European division. Your own team, unlimited creative control, complete authority over strategy and implementation." The salary figure made me sit down, £160,000 annually, plus relocation assistance, plus equity options that could triple my earnings within 2 years. It was the kind of opportunity people build entire careers hoping to encounter, handed to me precisely when I needed an escape route from the life I'd been desperately trying to save. "I know you've declined before," he continued, "but this role was designed specifically for your skill set. Think about it over the weekend. London's calling, and they want you specifically." For the first time in months, I found myself actually listening instead of automatically searching for reasons to decline. When Colton came home that evening, practically glowing from another successful day of supporting Daisy's emotional well-being, I didn't mention the call. The silence felt intentional, powerful. My first real secret in 4 years of marriage built on supposed transparency. He moved through our kitchen, preparing dinner while describing Daisy's latest breakthrough in processing her London transition. His voice carried the animation of someone genuinely invested in another person's success. The kind of enthusiasm he used to reserve for my professional victories. I watched him dice vegetables with practiced efficiency, noting how his face lit up when he talked about her progress, her insights, her growing confidence in navigating London's art scene. When he asked about my day, his attention felt perfunctory, going through the motions of spousal interest, while his real emotional investment lay elsewhere. October 15th arrived gray and bitter, matching the weather to the significance that I was the only one who remembered, our 4th wedding anniversary. The date we promised each other forever in front of 200 guests who probably assumed we'd figured out something the rest of them hadn't. I woke up alone in the guest room, having spent another night listening to Colton's muffled phone conversations through the walls. No flowers waited on the kitchen counter. No card sat propped against the coffee maker. No acknowledgement that this date held any meaning beyond being another Sunday in his carefully structured routine of emotional infidelity. Colton emerged from our bedroom, already dressed for another day with Daisy, wearing the watch I gave him for our 1st anniversary and the cologne that had become synonymous with betrayal. When I mentioned the date while making coffee, he looked genuinely surprised. Not guilty or apologetic, but confused, like I'd referenced some obscure holiday he'd never heard of. "Our anniversary," I said, wondering if he'd remember without prompting. Recognition dawned slowly, followed by that particular expression men wear when they realize they've forgotten something significant. "Of course. I'm sorry, I've been so distracted with work lately. We'll celebrate properly tonight, I promise. Dinner at that place you love. But the damage was done. He was so invested in his fantasy life with his ex-wife that he'd forgotten the actual anniversary of his real marriage, the date we stood before God and everyone we knew, promising to prioritize each other above all else. Don't worry about it, I said, and meant it more than he realized. I'm sure Daisy needs you today. He kissed my forehead with lips that felt like obligation before disappearing into his alternate reality. I spent the day alone in our house, surrounded by wedding photos that now looked like evidence of a crime I didn't know was being committed. The albums told a story of two people who believed they'd found something permanent, something worth building a life around. Young faces full of hope and certainty. Hands clasped like we'd never let go. Eyes that saw futures we were sure we'd share. Looking at those photos now felt like examining artifacts from a civilization that no longer exists. Sunday evening found me dialing James's number while Colton extended his anniversary celebration with Daisy into its 7th hour. We met at an all-night diner in Putney, the kind of place that serves coffee strong enough to fuel difficult conversations and fluorescent lighting that makes everyone look tired and honest. I spread my phone across the Formica table like evidence in a courtroom. Screenshots, bank statements, timelines, even voice memos I'd recorded documenting Colton's explanations for various inconsistencies. James examined each piece with the methodical attention he brings to client presentations, occasionally asking clarifying questions about dates or asking me to explain context I'd become too close to see clearly. Mrs. Patterson saw them holding hands in Richmond Park, I said, showing him notes I'd taken from our gardening conversation. The same Sunday, he claimed they had coffee to discuss her client crisis. James nodded without surprise, like he'd been expecting this evidence to surface eventually. When I finished presenting my case, months of documentation that painted an increasingly clear picture of systematic deception, he looked up from my phone with an expression I recognized from difficult client meetings. "You know what this is, don't you?" he said quietly. I nodded, unable to say the word affair out loud because speaking it would make it real in a way I wasn't sure I was ready to handle. But hearing James confirm my worst fears validated months of intuition I'd been questioning, instincts I'd been told to ignore in the name of trust and emotional maturity. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead while we sat in the kind of silence that follows devastating revelations. Outside, London continued its life while mine transformed into something unrecognizable. Something that would require choices I never imagined having to make. The fluorescent lights in the diner cast harsh shadows across James's face as he slid my phone back across the table. The evidence sat between us like a smoking gun. Neither of us wanted to find, but could no longer ignore. "What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice carrying the careful neutrality of someone who knows they're standing at the edge of someone else's life-changing decision. I stared at the phone screen, still displaying Daisy's gallery opening photo with my grandmother's earrings glinting under art world lighting. "I don't know yet," I said. But that wasn't entirely true. Somewhere in the back of my mind, a plan was already forming. Not revenge, exactly, but something that felt like self-preservation disguised as strategy. The months between October and February passed in a strange blur of parallel lives. I continued going to work, meeting clients, building campaigns that helped other people sell their dreams while mine decomposed in slow motion. Colton continued his Sunday rituals, his late-night phone calls, his elaborate explanations for charges and disappearances and timeline inconsistencies that multiplied like cancer cells. We existed in the same house like polite strangers, sharing space and bills and nothing else that mattered. He stopped apologizing for his absences, stopped offering explanations I no longer asked for. I'd stopped pretending to believe whatever story he'd constructed to justify his latest betrayal. The London offer hovered in my inbox like a lifeline I was afraid to grab. 3 times my boss called for an answer. 3 times I asked for more time to consider, knowing I was really waiting for Colton to give me permission to leave by finally being honest about wanting me to go. February arrived, gray and bitter, matching my mood as I sat in our kitchen at 7 a.m., reviewing client proposals that felt increasingly meaningless. Outside, Richmond looked like a watercolor painting left in the rain. All blurred edges and muted colors that mirrored the dissolution of everything I thought was permanent. Footsteps on the stairs announced Colton's arrival, though I could already tell from the sound that this wasn't his usual weekend casual descent. These steps had purpose, precision. The cadence of someone preparing for an important performance. He emerged from our bedroom looking like he was headed to a magazine photoshoot rather than coffee with a friend in emotional crisis. The cashmere sweater I gave him for Christmas. Charcoal gray Italian wool. Expensive enough that I'd hesitated before buying it. Dark jeans that cost more than most people's monthly grocery budget. Hair styled with products I'd never seen him use for any client meeting or social event in our 4 years of marriage. Another emergency situation with Daisy? I asked, without looking up from my laptop. Gallery politics, he said, adjusting his watch with the practiced motion of someone who'd performed this routine dozens of times. She's having trouble with a difficult gallery owner who's questioning her artistic vision. She needs someone who understands the business side of creative industries, right? Because overnight my husband became an expert in art world negotiations, despite never showing interest in creative fields beyond choosing what looks impressive on our walls. I watched him check his reflection in the hallway mirror, adjusting his collar with the kind of attention usually reserved for board presentations or important dates. The man looking back at him was someone I barely recognized. Not the person I married, but someone who'd been carefully constructed to appeal to someone else's aesthetic preferences. Stay home with me instead, I suggested, closing my laptop with deliberate calm. We could drive to Bath like we used to. Find that antique market you mentioned wanting to visit. His reaction was immediate and visceral, like I'd suggested something genuinely offensive. His face transformed from casual preparation to active irritation, eyebrows drawing together in the expression he reserves for unreasonable client demands. I can't abandon her when she needs support, he said, the word abandon delivered with emphasis that made its implications crystal clear. Abandon. Apparently, leaving his ex-wife alone for one Sunday would constitute abandonment. Cruel, thoughtless desertion of someone in crisis. But leaving his actual wife alone every weekend for 4 months straight was just maintaining healthy adult friendships. The irony sat between us like a live wire nobody wanted to touch. What about what I need? The question came out quieter than I intended, but it carried enough weight to make him pause in his preparations for a moment. I thought he might actually consider the question. Might remember that he had a wife who'd been increasingly invisible in his carefully curated life. Might acknowledge that I'd been patient and understanding and cooperative while he systematically prioritized another woman over our marriage. Instead, his face hardened into the expression he uses during hostile business negotiations. Cold, calculating, designed to end conversations rather than continue them. We've discussed this exhaustively, Paige. Daisy and I are friends. Adults can maintain platonic relationships with their exes without it meaning anything inappropriate. He paused, studying my expression with the analytical precision he brings to financial assessments that determine whether investments are worth pursuing. Actually, he continued, his voice taking on the measured cadence of someone delivering a prepared statement, if you can't trust me spending every weekend with my ex-wife, maybe we shouldn't be together at all. The silence that followed felt infinite, like the moment between lightning and thunder, when the whole world holds its breath. I could hear our neighbor's dog barking at something only it could see. Sunday morning traffic beginning to build on Richmond Road. Our antique grandfather clock in the hallway ticking away seconds of our marriage with mechanical precision. But mostly I heard the sound of 4 years of carefully constructed life finally cracking down the middle, splitting along fault lines that had been developing for months. Without either of us acknowledging the structural damage, he'd given me an ultimatum disguised as a choice: accept his relationship with Daisy or end our marriage, trust him completely or lose him entirely, submit to his version of reality or face the consequences of questioning it. What he didn't realize is that he'd also given me permission to end the charade with my dignity intact. I looked him directly in the eyes, seeing clearly for the first time in months the man standing in our hallway, wearing clothes I bought him, cologne he saves for another woman, styling his hair for someone who isn't his wife. This wasn't my husband anymore. This was someone wearing my husband's face, living in my house, spending my emotional energy while giving his authentic self to someone else entirely. You're absolutely right, I said, my voice carrying a calm that surprised us both. His face went through fascinating changes. Confusion first, like a computer processing conflicting information. Then alarm, as he realized this wasn't the script he'd written in his head. He'd expected tears, accusations, maybe even a dramatic scene he could later describe to Daisy as evidence of my emotional instability and his justified need for support from someone who understands him better. What he hadn't expected was agreement, calm, rational, immediate agreement that his ultimatum made perfect sense. Wait, he said, his confident negotiation stance faltering. That's not, we should talk about this. No, I cut him off, meaning every word with surgical precision. I'm done with the entire elaborate performance of pretending our marriage can survive someone who's already emotionally divorced himself from it. Done pretending that love means accepting lies as truth. That trust means ignoring evidence. That commitment means tolerating systematic betrayal as friendship. He stood in our hallway, looking like someone who'd just realized they'd overplayed their hand in a game they thought they controlled. The ultimatum that was supposed to silence my questions had instead given me the clarity I'd been searching for since that first Sunday morning when everything started changing. For the first time in months, I knew exactly what I was going to do next. Colton stood frozen in our hallway, his carefully styled hair and expensive cologne suddenly looking like costume pieces from a play that's ended mid-performance. The confidence he'd worn like armor while delivering his ultimatum had evaporated, leaving behind someone who looked genuinely confused about how his power play had backfired so spectacularly. We should talk about this, he said again, his voice carrying a note of panic that wasn't there 5 minutes ago. We just did, I replied, gathering my laptop and client files with the calm efficiency of someone who's finally stopped fighting against the inevitable. You were very clear about your priorities. He followed me upstairs, his footsteps quick and uncertain behind me. I could feel him watching as I moved around our bedroom, our former bedroom, collecting the work materials I'd need for what was about to become the most important Sunday of my professional life. Paige, wait, I didn't mean we should actually separate. I was just trying to explain how important it is for you to trust me. Trust. The word that's been weaponized against me for months used to make me question my instincts and ignore obvious evidence. Now it sounded hollow, meaningless, like calling rain dry or darkness bright. I do trust you, I said, pulling my laptop charger from the wall outlet. I trust you to prioritize Daisy over everything else. I trust you to lie about where you go and what you do. I trust you to forget our anniversary while remembering every detail of her gallery openings. He opened his mouth to protest, but I continued before he could construct another elaborate fiction. Most importantly, I trust that you meant exactly what you said downstairs. If I can't accept your relationship with your ex-wife, we shouldn't be together. So, we won't be. I left him standing in our bedroom doorway and headed to my home office, the room that was about to become my war room for executing the most important strategic decision of my life. The London email sat in my inbox like a door I'd been afraid to open, afraid of what might lie beyond the familiar confines of Richmond and routine, and a marriage that felt safe even while it was suffocating me. But safety is an illusion when you're drowning slowly. And I'd been underwater for so long I'd forgotten what breathing felt like. My fingers hovered over the keyboard for only a moment before muscle memory took over, typing words that felt like they were coming from some stronger, clearer version of myself I haven't met in years. Subject: London Division Director position. Acceptance. I'm ready to accept the role. When can we discuss transition logistics and start dates? Thank you for your patience with my decision-making process. I'm excited about this opportunity. I hit send before I could second-guess myself, before the part of my brain that's been trained to prioritize other people's comfort over my own advancement could interfere with this moment of perfect clarity. The response came faster than I expected, within 4 hours, even on a Sunday evening when most executives are home with their families. Brilliant news. Can you start in 3 weeks? We'll handle all relocation logistics, including temporary housing and permanent flat hunting assistance. Welcome to the London team. We've been hoping you'd say yes. 3 weeks. 21 days to dismantle a life I'd spent 4 years building and reconstructed in a city where nobody knew my history. Where I could be someone other than the wife who wasn't enough to keep her husband's attention. Downstairs, I could hear Colton on the phone, probably calling Daisy to describe his domestic crisis and seek comfort from the woman who's apparently better equipped to understand his emotional needs than his actual wife. The conversation lasted over an hour. His voice carrying the same animated tone that used to be reserved for discussions about our future. Monday morning arrived with the predictable sound of Colton attempting damage control. His footsteps on the stairs were heavier than usual, weighed down by the kind of regret that only surfaces after consequences become visible. He appeared in our kitchen, wearing that particular expression men get when they realize they've overplayed their hand, sheepish, but defensive. Sorry, but not really. Like someone who's been caught cheating at cards, but wants to argue about the rules rather than acknowledge their behavior. About yesterday, he began, adjusting his cufflinks with nervous precision. I think we both said things we didn't mean. Heat of the moment, you know. We've been under a lot of stress lately. I looked up from my coffee, genuinely curious about his revisionist interpretation of events. Stress? As if external circumstances forced him to prioritize his ex-wife over our marriage. As if spending every weekend with another woman was something that happened to him rather than something he chose repeatedly. Which part didn't I mean? I asked, my voice carrying the calm interest of someone observing a fascinating psychological experiment. The part where I agreed with your assessment of our relationship, or the part where I accepted that we shouldn't be together? He ran his hand through his hair, the same gesture he makes during difficult client presentations when the numbers don't support the narrative he's trying to sell. You know what I meant, Paige? You were being. He stopped himself before finishing that sentence, probably remembering how well calling me ridiculous worked out yesterday. I was being what, Colton? Emotional? Reactive? This whole thing with Daisy has you seeing problems that don't exist. The audacity was breathtaking. For months of systematic deception, forgotten anniversaries, missing jewelry, and financial infidelity. And I'm the one creating problems by noticing them. I signed the transfer papers, I said, simply, watching his face process the information like a computer running too many programs simultaneously. The kitchen went completely silent except for our espresso machine's gentle hum and the sound of Colton's carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. What transfer papers? London. The director position I've been offered 3 times. The one worth nearly double my current salary. I start in 3 weeks. His coffee cup hit the marble counter with a sharp crack, sending brown liquid across the surface in patterns that looked like abstract art. He stared at me like I'd announced plans to join a space mission or become a professional acrobat, something so foreign to his understanding of who I am that his brain couldn't process the information. You can't be serious. We never discussed this. You can't just make unilateral decisions about our future. The hypocrisy was so perfect, I almost laughed. The same man who's been making unilateral decisions about our weekends for months, who's been conducting a relationship with his ex-wife without consulting me about the impact on our marriage, was suddenly concerned about collaborative decision-making. Actually, I replied, wiping up the spilled coffee with paper towels that somehow felt symbolic of cleaning up messes that weren't originally mine. Especially when you've made it clear that our future isn't really a priority. That's not fair. You know how I'm stressed. It looks like Daisy's career concerns, Daisy's emotional needs, and Daisy's social calendar have been significantly more important than anything involving your actual wife. He started to protest, but I continued before he could launch into another elaborate explanation about the innocence of professional friendships and the maturity of maintaining relationships with ex-spouses. The house goes on the market Friday, I added, because there's no point in drawing out revelations that will be devastating regardless of timing. The blood drained from his face so quickly I worried he might actually faint. You can't sell our house. It's our home. It's where we've built our life together. It's my house, I corrected gently, though the gentleness was more for my own peace of mind than his comfort. The mortgage, the deed, the down payment, all in my name alone. I bought it 6 months before we got married, remember? You just helped choose the furnishings. The financial reality settled over him like a physical weight. Colton earns well for someone his age, but he'd grown accustomed to our combined lifestyle. The kind of comfortable existence that requires two professional incomes to maintain without stress. "I can't afford anything comparable on my own," he admitted, his voice small in a way I hadn't heard since his father's business failed during our second year of marriage. "I know," I said, and meant it without cruelty. "But that's not my problem anymore." The man standing in my kitchen, in my house, wearing clothes I bought him, suddenly looked like someone I was seeing clearly for the first time. Not the partner I thought I'd married, but someone who'd been living in my space, spending my emotional energy, taking advantage of my investment in our shared future while pursuing his own interests with someone else entirely. 3 weeks suddenly felt like both too much time and not nearly enough to extract myself from 4 years of entangled finances, shared possessions, and the elaborate infrastructure of a marriage that was apparently much more important to me than to him. But for the first time in months, I felt something that resembled excitement rather than dread when I thought about what came next. 3 weeks felt like both eternity and no time at all when you're dismantling a life piece by piece. The days blurred into a routine of boxes, legal paperwork, and the strange intimacy of dividing shared possessions with someone who's become a stranger. Colton moved through our house like a ghost, haunting his own life, occasionally attempting conversations that felt more like negotiations than genuine communication. The morning of my departure arrived, gray and drizzling, London weather that somehow felt appropriate for endings. I was sealing the last of my boxes when the doorbell rang with the persistence of someone who has news that can't wait. James stood on our porch, his face set in an expression I recognized from our most difficult client meetings. The look he wears when he's discovered something significant that no one's going to want to hear. "We need to talk," he said, stepping into my hallway without waiting for invitation. "Before you leave, there's something you should see." He set his laptop on our dining room table, the same table where Colton and I used to plan dinner parties and discuss weekend trips we'd never take. The screen loaded with the methodical efficiency of someone who'd spent considerable time organizing evidence. "I was running social media analytics for that gallery client," James began, his fingers moving across the keyboard with practiced precision. Daisy Morrison's name came up in the data. So I did some deeper research. What I found changes everything. The screen filled with screenshots, timestamps, and social media posts, arranged with the kind of systematic organization that made my marketing background appreciate the thoroughness, even while my heart sank at the implications. "The Sunday brunches," James said, clicking through images that loaded like evidence in a courtroom presentation. "They weren't emergency counseling sessions at local cafes. Look at these locations." The photos told a different story than any Colton had ever shared with me. Sketch, the trendy Shoreditch restaurant with a 40 pounds tasting menu. Chiltern Firehouse, where celebrities go to be photographed. The River Cafe, which requires reservations booked months in advance and costs more per meal than most people's weekly grocery budget. These aren't the kind of places you grab coffee to help someone through a professional crisis. These are deliberate destinations, the kind of restaurants where people go to impress each other, to create memories, to mark occasions that matter. "She's been documenting everything," James continued, his voice carrying the careful,